Okay, welcome. We'll begin in just about a minute. Again, feel free to turn on your videos so we can see you and feel like we are together in a class. Okay, so again, welcome. This is Drisha's spring program and the final class in this series on death and the afterlife in the Rabbinic and Kabbalistic imagination with Dr. Nathaniel Berman. Again, we encourage you to turn on your video just so we can feel like we are together in a traditional classroom. Feel free to ask questions by writing comments in the chat box here on Zoom, or as a comment if you will be watching us live on Facebook. Right now we have a little trouble with that live link. With that, I'll turn this to Dr. Berman.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our fourth and final session. I want to begin this session with a little story from my own life, which is that when I was a sophomore in college, I took a course on existentialism with a great philosopher named Maurice Nathanson, Zichrono Livracha. And he, at the end of, I was 19 or 20, and I wasn't really interested in thinking about death. But existentialism is a lot about death and also about life and love and everything. At the end of the semester, he said, the very last class, he looked at us, and he was probably in his 60s at that time, I suspect, probably in his late 60s. And he looks at us and he says, you know, this is going to end now. So everything I've been saying about death applies to this course. This course, the fact that it has a beginning, has an end, we will never meet again in this group to engage in this activity again. And that's a sign of our mortality, our finitude as human beings. And at the time, I really was disturbed by what he said, and I didn't get it, but I remember it very well now, many decades later. And I tell the story at the end of most of my courses. I feel there's a certain kind of sadness that I've felt ever since I started teaching in my late 20s, a certain kind of sadness at the end of each course. And that feeling, I really put a name to it. It's a certain kind of grieving. And this is sort of a sort of an experience of mortality, of finitude, that things actually do come to an end. So I might get a little mawkish at the end. I just want to warn you. The other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that the topic that we're going to focus on tonight is one, as I wrote in the email, that for many of you might be beyond the stretch to which you've stretched your religious imaginations up to today. For others of you, it's the moment you've been waiting for. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about reincarnation. So the group is somewhat, a lot of different stances towards it. Many of you may be unaware or may have been unaware up to this point that this theme by the name of Gilgul is deeply rooted in Kabbalah for at least going on 8.5 centuries. So it is not something, some new agey thing. It's deeply, deeply, deeply rooted, and in fact became more or less central to Kabbalist's idea about the human soul, certainly by the 16th century, with the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria of the Ari. But it really starts already sometime, at least by the late 12th century. It is already taken for granted as deeply rooted in the tradition. So I'm going to, as I said in the email, try to make it accessible in a way that relates it to some of the themes we've been dealing with in the course, relating to the notion of the self as an embodied self, and the notion of the self as a process of unification of a multifaceted being, a process of unification rather than something starting out already unified. For both of those reasons, in a way, the idea of the English word reincarnation only translates it very approximately and is really in some ways misleading. But we have no other English word that really captures it. So we use it, but it is misleading, certainly in the way in which most people think of it, and we'll see why. Okay, so with that, I'm going to put my PowerPoint on the screen. Again, we have a Chagall painting. This one is actually called The Myth of Orpheus. And somehow it struck me, somehow the souls moving through really struck me as a good way of starting, but I don't want to dwell on this. It's also a very beautiful painting. And I'm going to start with a clarification of sort of the way in which Judaism since rabbinic times has structured the notion of different phases, different epochs, or different ways of understanding the relationship between life and afterlife. And this fourfold division only became clear as time went on. In the Talmud itself, it's not always so clear that these terms are used consistently, but this kind of division becomes gradually clear in post-Talmudic times, even really in Talmudic times, towards the end perhaps. And I've just, for those of you familiar with the Saturday morning liturgy, this is a familiar 4 lines before the great song El Adon. For those familiar with it, for those not familiar with it, just take my word for it. This comes from the Saturday morning liturgy. And it talks about how incomparable God is, right? And it divides it into 4, what I'm here calling 4 epochs. There's nothing as valuable as you, God, our Elohim, in this world, Olam Hazeh. And there's none other than you are king in the life of the world to come, Olam Haba. Okay, this world, the world to come. And then there are 2 other times. There's nothing other than you are Redeemer in the days of the Messiah, and there's none who resembles you, our Savior, in the resurrection of the dead. So these are really 4 different times or epochs. This world, the world to come, eventually, although it's not so clear in the Talmud, but eventually it becomes clarified as the world right after death, the fate of the soul right after death, then the days of the Messiah at the end of history, and then the resurrection of the dead at the end of the Messianic period. 4 really different things, and I just wanted to clarify that, because again, even in the Talmud, the terminology is not necessarily used consistently for the last 3. For the first one, yes, but not the last 3. Okay, but what about Gilgul, reincarnation? And so here I say this is so we had 4 times. They're not quite linearly, they're somewhat linearly. There's biological life, there's life after death, Olam Haba, the world to come. Then there's the Messiah at the end of history. Then there's the resurrection of the dead at the end of the Messianic time. What about this idea of Gilgul, of reincarnation? Right? That's a cyclical idea, and it doesn't seem to fit into this 4-part schema. Where does that come from, and how does that fit in? And so just a little historical background, which is, when did Jews start believing in reincarnation? When did that start happening? Well, we don't really know exactly. There were certainly people who believed in reincarnation in ancient times. In Greek mythology, reincarnation plays a big role. In Plato, you find Socrates discussing reincarnation. He even gives what seems to be almost a logical proof of reincarnation. Although with Plato, you never know really when he quotes these Greek myths what he really believed in or not. But that's not so important for our purposes. The point is that in Greek culture, there was this strong belief in reincarnation. Certainly, of course, famously, in Indian culture, reincarnation plays a very big role. And we have learned over the last generation, scholars have shown lots of interaction between India, between South Asia and the Middle East, and even in across the Judeo-Arabic world in the Middle Ages. Where does it come from? We don't know. We know that there were Jews who believed in reincarnation in the 10th century. How do we know it? Because Saadia Gaon, a famous Jewish thinker, denounced them. And the fact that he felt the need to denounce them shows that there was somebody to denounce. Some of the Karaites believed in reincarnation. So we know that there were Jews who believed in reincarnation. Again, an important enough group so that a great authority felt the need to denounce them. Where does it first become really mainstreamed? Or when does it really come into, or what would become mainstream Jewish thought? Okay, so that's So this is, again, this title, Gilgul, which literally means revolving, and which I put a reincarnation in quotes for reasons I'll try to get to. And then I ask, is it a cyclical dimension in Kabbalistic time, as opposed to the 4 epochs that I started with? And so what I'm going to start with is this text. The first time it really appears in a Jewish text, a text that would become incredibly important from then on. This book called the Sefer HaBahir, the Book of Clarity, which appears in Provence in the late 12th century, around 1170 or so. It becomes a central text for Kabbalah from then on. The circumstances of his composition are a little bit mysterious, it's a little bit unclear. It seems that some parts of it are very, very old, but perhaps not the parts of it that are recognizably Kabbalistic in a strict sense. There's a lot of research on it, it's very fragmentary. In any event, in the Sefer HaBahir, there are many discussions of what we would call reincarnation, or what we might call reincarnation. The word Gilgul is not used, but there are many discussions, mostly in the form of rather obscure parables. And I'm just going to give you this is just one quick text from the Sefer HaBahir, quoting a verse from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet, from the fourth verse, a generation goes and a generation comes, dor holech v'dor ba, right? And the puzzle here is, shouldn't it say a generation comes and a generation goes, right? At least that's the hook for the rabbinic, or for the Jewish imagination. Always tries to find an issue or puzzling thing in a verse, even if it may not be puzzling. A generation goes and a generation comes. So why does it go first and then comes? Rabbi Akiva said, a generation comes, in other words, the verse says, after it says a generation goes, for it has already come. So every generation that's coming, it was actually already here. Everybody get that? In other words, the idea here is that when a new generation comes, it's composed of souls that had already come to the earth. And that's why the verse starts off, a generation goes, and then only afterwards a generation comes, to let you know that the new generation is actually a revisiting of a previous generation. That's the Sefer HaBahir, and as I say, there are many discussions of it in this book. The book seems to take for granted, doesn't need to justify it. It seems to take for granted that the readers of it, or the oral listeners to it, will know what they're talking about. And again, this book appears around 1170 in Provence, and again is often called the first recognizably Kabbalistic work. Something else from Provence around that time is one of the leading Kabbalists in Provence at the time was named, I can't get this to go, here we go, named Isaac the Blind, Yitzchak Sagi Nahor. And this is a quote actually from a 13th century Kabbalist, Menachem Rekanati, who lived in Italy, who wrote a very important commentary on the Torah using Kabbalistic ideas and images. And he's in Italy, so he's in Italy in the second half of the 13th century, and he's saying a story that he heard about Isaac the Blind, who lived a couple of generations earlier, who died shortly, 15 years before Rekanati was born. And Isaac the Blind, again, was one of the first Kabbalists whose names we know, and a very influential figure, lived in Provence. And he says this, Rekanati, I've heard that the pious Rabbi Yitzchak ben Avraham ben David, also known as Isaac the Blind, Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, could recognize in the face of a person whether they were from the new souls or the old souls. So already in the late 13th century, there is an idea that this is an old tradition, right? And quoting this great authority figure by the late 13th century, he's already a great authority figure in Kabbalistic circles, Isaac the Blind. And part of the reason I keep on saying Isaac the Blind, you say, well, that's how he's known, Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, is that, remember what it just said on the screen? He could recognize in the face of a person whether they were from the old souls or the new souls. Now, he couldn't physically see the face of the person, right? So when it says that he could recognize in the face of a person, it was obviously some other kind of recognition than physical sight. with some kind of non-physical intuition that is attributed here to Isaac the Blind, of being able to tell whether someone's soul was for their first time in a body, or whether they were, whether it was a second time or some other time, right? And again, as I say, here we have by the 13th century, it's already deeply rooted, and there are already legends about these rabbinical figures. Well, for all I know, it might be a true story that migrated from Provence all the way to Italy in a couple of generations, about the powers of Isaac the Blind. And again, really one of the founding figures of Kabbalah in the historically specific sense.
Nathaniel, so Isaac the Blind, one of his main pupils, he has a few, but one of them is Yehuda ben Yakar.
Yes.
Yehuda ben Yakar, who is a great Talmudist. I think he was from Provence originally. He's one of the Balei HaTosfot, but he's well known for a couple of different things. One is he wrote about prayer, which is very interesting. But the other thing is he was the teacher of one of the two teachers of the Ramban. And I don't know if we're going to get to the Ramban, but the Ramban, his commentary on the Torah, talks about Gilgul. And I don't know if you intend to get there or not, but that's one of the real classics. I mean, Isaac the Blind is a great Kabbalist, but the Ramban is also a great Kabbalist, but he's also the primary halachist and Talmudic expert of his time, one of the true greats. So he actually puts it out there. He hits it, but it's not 100% clear, but he's the one who actually, in terms of his commentary on the Torah, says it straight out. In two different places, he talks about reincarnation. So I don't know if you plan to get there or not, but that's interesting.
Yes. So part of the reason I'm not giving a text from the Ramban in this course is because the Ramban, when he wrote about Kabbalah, he wrote he didn't think it should be explicated in print at great length. He thought it should be kept more secret, which makes most of his Kabbalistic writings in his commentary on the Torah very, very, they're hints and allusions, and he writes very tersely about it. But certainly the Ramban refers to it very explicitly, and the students of the Ramban, such as Rabbi ben Asher and others, talk about it at great length. Rabbi ben Asher was a student of the Ramban who comes afterwards and wrote at much greater length, explicating the Ramban's Kabbalistic hints, and you get more fuller. Really, in the Ramban, you get most of Kabbalistic doctrine that a lot of people think originated with the Zohar, but really comes much earlier, and specifically in the Ramban. So thank you for that.
He also refers to reincarnation. He uses a different, I'm not sure he uses the word Gilgul, but the term that he uses, at least in Bereshit, is Sod HaIbor, which is very striking, because Sod HaIbor in the Talmud refers to the calendar.
Yes.
It refers to the way the calendar, the intercalation of the calendar. And the Ramban used that term. I think some people disagree, but I think what I've read is that most think that Sod HaIbor in that passage, it's about levirate marriage, is a reference to reincarnation. So he calls it a sod. He says it straight up. It's the great mystery. He doesn't want to, as you say, he doesn't want to be explicit about it, but it's pretty clear what he's getting at, I think.
Yes, and it's yes, completely. In fact, here we go. Here's some of the.
Oh, what do you know? Okay.
Here we have the terms for Gil. So Gilgul becomes the main term towards the end of the 13th century. Becomes the main term for what we might call reincarnation. But before that, there are several other terms. So one term is ha'ataka, which means displacement. You find that in the Torah in terms of Avram, for example, he pulled up his tents and he moved somewhere else. Vayatek misham. So ha'ataka is one term used in the early 13th century texts. The other is Sod HaIbur, which, as David just mentioned, means literally mystery of pregnancy or mystery of impregnation, but is used again for reincarnation in the early mid-13th century Kabbalistic texts. Two other terms are hitchalfut, which means exchange or metamorphosis, and then closely related din b'nei chiluf, law governing or the judgment governing those subject to metamorphosis. And as David just said, what's interesting is, and not completely clear why, is that in the 13th century, or actually not in the Sefer Rabbi here, but in the early to mid 13th century, this mystery of reincarnation is treated by the Kabbalists as one of the great mysteries that you shouldn't say too much about. And it's really a little bit unclear why, because other things they were saying were much greater scandals from a theological, if you were a philosophical theologian, let's say if you were Maimonides, a lot of other things that the Kabbalists were saying were even more scandalous than reincarnation. And yet, for some reason, and it's unclear exactly why, in the early to mid 13th century, this topic was treated as something very, very secret and that shouldn't be discussed at length. By the end of the 13th century, that's no longer the case. But it's a little bit unclear why, again, because in the 12th century, it's not treated that way. Gershom Shalom, in his work on Gilgul, he also says that he doesn't know why. It's unclear why. And I just want to leave it there that it was treated by these early Kabbalists as this great secret. Although, again, as I say, pretty soon, or at least within a century, it's talked about quite openly and at great length. But it's just something to think about as we go through these materials. So here are these various terms. Interestingly enough, in the Sefer Rabbi here, there is no term. It discusses it quite clearly through parables, but there is no actual term for it. It's very strange. And eventually the word Gilgul sort of becomes the main word, and Ibur is reserved for something else that we're going to get to towards the end. Okay. So now I want to go into this theme of how I'm going to relate this to things we've done earlier. And also a little bit why I think that reincarnation, at least in the way it's usually used, is not necessarily the best term for it. So this first lengthy text, or a substantial text I'm giving you, I put under the theme of Gilgul as the attainment of the divine image in the human body. Now we all know that in Genesis it says that God created the human being in the image of God, right? Famously. B'tselem Elohim, right? In the image of Elohim, right? B'tzalmo kidmuto, in his image and his likeness. And that's an incredibly inspiring passage. It's been used for all kinds of very good ways, a real humanism, and an incredibly inspiring idea. In Kabbalah, really in this text we're about to look at, it's not a general idea, in this text we're about to look at, they take this idea that they have, that I've talked about the human being always in a process of becoming, not given, that the selfhood is something you attain. They apply it to this idea of the image of God, that the image of God is something you have to strive for. And here's the passage. So this passage is from a book called the Tikkunei Zohar, which I've talked about, the adornments of the Zohar. It's written slightly after the main body of the Zohar, probably towards the very end of the 13th century, but probably maybe the first decade of the 14th century. Also written in Aramaic, also written in Spain. The author is completely anonymous. I don't think scholars don't even have a guess as to who wrote it. And some of the passages in this book have become part of the liturgy. For example, in synagogues in which Kabbalah is a big influence, for example, in Hasidic synagogues, or in North African and the Middle Eastern synagogues from communities from there, there's a long passage from this book called the Patach Eliyahu, which is called the prayer before prayer, which is recited before every prayer as preparation for prayer. And here's this passage about Gilgul, from the Tikkunei Zohar that is not only about Gilgul, but also about generally doing mitzvot, doing good deeds, ritual performances. And it goes like this. A person must crown the Blessed Holy One over each and every limb. Again, this is the embodied self idea that I'm stressing in the Kabbalistic texts. The idea that you crown God in your limbs, in the body, God in the body, and to prepare for him a clean and pure place to dwell therein. Therefore, a person must burn away from each and every limb all thoughts and all evil illuminations of filth, which are klipot. Klipot is a word meaning husks or shells, and it's one of the words in Kabbalah for the demonic element in the universe. So you have to burn away all the sort of the schmutz from your limbs, right, in order to make your body a pure place for the divine. And how do you do this crowning? Well, once you burn away all the bad stuff, you must instead inflame one's limb, light up one's limb, kindle one's limbs with all fitting mitzvot. Actually, the word here is ksherim, kosher mitzvot, which dwell on each and every limb, for they are candles. The mitzvot are candles. So you're lighting up instead, so you burn away the bad stuff, and you light your body up with mitzvot. And this role of fire is very deeply related to, this is not talking about afterlife, not talking about hell, but it's very much related to the kind of purification we talked about in the river of fire after death. And here we have this idea of burning away the bad stuff and then lighting yourself up with the candles of mitzvot. For every mitzvah is called a candle, as it is written, for mitzvah is a candle. Right? Kiner mitzvah, also in the, I guess not in the liturgy, but anyway, kiner mitzvah, right? And also, so a mitzvah is a candle, and also the human soul is a candle, as in the verse, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The human soul is a candle of God. Okay. So you're lighting up yourself with mitzvot, with your limbs. Happy is one who makes the Blessed Holy One dwell in each and every limb, to make for him a place to dwell therein, and to crown him in each and every limb, so that there will not be a limb empty of him. Again, this is the idea that doing mitzvot is actually investing yourself with the divine. And this itself, forget about reincarnation, is a very radical teaching. This idea of the physicality of doing mitzvot, right? And it's not just an intellectual thing, it's a way of inhabiting the divine. Now, of course, we know that Judaism is really into ritual practices, lots of rituals we do with our bodies. We wrap ourselves in this, we smell that, we drink the other thing, we eat something else. It's a very physical religion, right? And here it takes that to the extreme of actually saying that doing the mitzvot affects the body. It's a way of bringing God into the body. And that passage that I said is read in Hasidic liturgy and in North African, Middle Eastern liturgy, is about, and here is a great secret, right? The correspondence of the different parts of the body with the different sfirot. The different sfirot are the component parts of the divine in Kabbalah. And the different component parts of the divine are viewed as situated in different parts of the human body. So there's a correspondence between the human body and the divine, you'll pardon the expression, the divine body. And the way to make that relationship is by doing mitzvot, by kindling the divine in the body so that different aspects of the divine are invested in different limbs. Some correspond to the right arm, the left arm, the mind, the heart, the legs, and so forth. Right? Mitzvot as a kind of, well, I'm not really sure what the analogy is, but it's a way of, if you'll pardon the expression, God becoming incarnate in the human body. And that's really what this says, literally what it says. So this itself would be Dayenu. If this was the only teaching I was going to do tonight, that would be enough, because it's very, very radical teaching. And you find this in different forms throughout the Tikkun Zohar. But what if you don't make it in one lifetime? But for if a limb is lacking, and here we're not talking about people who have tragically lost a limb through an accident, or people who have, have suffered various kinds of damage to their physical body. We're obviously talking here about a spiritual body related to the ethereal body that I talked about in the first session. For if a limb is lacking, so that the Blessed Holy One does not dwell over it, for the sake of this limb, the person returns to the world in Gilgul, reincarnation, until he is completed in his limbs. In other words, you keep on coming back in Gilgul so that you can complete your body, so that they will all be complete. All the limbs will be complete in the image of the Blessed Holy One. So it says, human beings are created in the image of God, but here that's the potential. And how do you become in the image of God? By crowning God in the body. And once God is completely invested in your body, incarnated in your body, then you are taka in the image of God. For if one is lacking, one limb is lacking in the divine, the person is not in the image of the Blessed Holy One. So the way you become this potential of being in the image of God, as it says in Genesis, is by crowning God in the body, performing every mitzvah which corresponds to each and every limb, which corresponds to the divine limbs, and it might take several lifetimes, right, in order for you to become in the image of God. And really, they go on and say, because if you're not, then in a way it's like idolatry, because you're in the image of something else. If you're not in the image of the Blessed Holy One, you must be in you have some image. What image is it? Well, it's in the image of something else, another God, who doesn't have these limbs, the same limbs, or whose limbs are imperfect spiritually. And again, I'm not talking about any kind of physical, physical handicap or anything like that, disability, right? You have to go through this process of Gilgul. And then the Tikkun Zohar goes on and it says, and you can come back even 3 or 4 times. And then it says, and that's only the 3 or 4 time limit. At first it says, you can come back up to 4 times, and if you fail, then you're just annihilated. You don't come back anymore, and actually you're annihilated. You get karet. And then it says, no, that's only if you don't improve at all. If you actually, what it says is that's only if you are a rasha, an evil person. But a tzaddik can come back up to 1,000 generations, a righteous person. And this is, what do we mean by a righteous person? Someone who's improved even just a little bit. So if you've taken your 4 lifetimes and improved just a little bit, then you get up to 1,000 generations. And they quote a verse that says that I will visit the sins of the fathers and the sons up to 4 generations, but I will do kindness to those who love me up to 1,000 generations, right? And they say that's really talking about Gilgul, right? This idea of becoming who you really are, and it might take several generations because you are not in the image of God until you have completed this work. So this is the idea of Gilgul, right, as something that's done when you haven't fully lived up to the image of God in one lifetime, right? And you have to go and do it again. Now, part of the reason I say this is not reincarnation the way people usually think of, for 2 reasons. First of all, because what's quite clear is that reincarnation here and in almost all the materials, with one exception, we'll get to it, it's a punishment, basically. Or it's a punishment, or it's a sign of deficiency. It's a sign you have more work to do. People say, yeah, I was, in a past life, I was, the Queen of Sheba, or I was, Abraham Lincoln in a past life. People never say I was, Abraham Lincoln's, shoe polisher. They were always Abraham Lincoln, right? And when people use it as sort of a way to, I have nothing against it, it's fine, to make themselves feel good. It's good. I was great. You think I'm just this schnook that you see before you? No, I was the Baal Shem Tov in a past life. It's a way of, but here this is the opposite. That's first of all. It's a sign of deficiency. It's a sign of tikkun. It's a process of tikkun, right? That goes on. The other reason I say that it's not reincarnation the way people usually think it is because when people say that, they have this idea that there's some self that stays the same, that moves through history. Here, no. You haven't yet become yourself. It's not that I was X in a past life, because you were not in a past life. You didn't actually get to be the self that you are, or that you could be, right? And I want to take a question, but I want to take a deep breath, and I just want to say this, right? Again, I know that for some of you, all this is a big stretch. Some of you, it's not. Some of you, this is what you actually were waiting for. But I want to say this, and I said this, one thing I said in the email was that Judaism obviously is a very historical religion. There's a lot of emphasis of our relationship to our ancestors. That's a huge part of Judaism. The first two blessings of the Amidah are devoted to our relationship to ancestors. Certainly the first one. The second one is about the resurrection of the dead. The other thing I want to say, and so we're constantly situated in relationship to the ancestors. Zchut Avot, the merit of the ancestors, is a big deal. And we're constantly saying it every blessing, every time we're constantly evoking the ancestors. The other thing I want to say is this. Let's say you don't believe in anything, right? What is certainly true, first of all, there's DNA. Okay, that's first of all. Certainly you're literally physically the product of everything that came before you. And then also everything else, your language. You didn't, let's say English is your first language. You didn't invent English. And anyone who speaks more than one language knows that you think slightly differently in different languages. Everyone who speaks two languages fluently knows this. You think differently in different languages. That means the language is shaping you at least in part, as well as you shaping the language. And you're the product of your culture and your habits. And if you have the habit of scratching your head like this, it's very well possible that that's something you learned from one of your parents or whoever brought you up, and that might go back who knows how far. Maybe it was some Neanderthal ancestor in a cave who first got that habit, and their children saw it, and eventually they mated with a Homo sapiens, and there you are scratching your head in 2021. But the first one who did it was a Neanderthal living in a cave somewhere. It's very, very possible. It's not fiction, right? You didn't invent yourself. Life happened, human beings were living long before you were around, and they'll continue living, hopefully, for a long time after, right? And you inhabit the human chain for a time, right? But there's so much about you that you didn't invent, that you're actually carrying forward, right? Now, that's not quite reincarnation the way it's being talked about here, but it's a way of thinking about it. Just a way of thinking about it, of a certain kind of modesty about our mastery or self-invention in this life. Those are some ways into it for the skeptics on the screen. All right, let's take a deep breath, and let me take a couple of oral questions before I go on with something much harder and complicated.
If I could, the end of the pasuk of Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam is Chofes Kol Chadrei Vaten,
yes,
which is either reveals or searches, for the inner secrets or the inner, and you don't have to come to the concept of Gilgulim. It's man's constant search of the God within, or this constant process of tikkun during lifetime.
Yes, it's an amazing verse. It happens to be. Some people may know that you're supposed to choose a verse that begins and ends with the first and last letter of your Hebrew name. And the reason you're supposed to do that is because when you die, the angels will ask you your name, and it's very important not to forget your name. And you might forget your name, but you won't forget the verse.
It's my verse, actually.
It's your verse, Chaim? No.
Natan.
Oh, my Hebrew name is Nisan, so it's my verse too.
Yes.
So it's very important, everybody. If you don't have a verse, get one, because it's very important to not forget your name, and that will help you remember your name after death. Okay. Can I take one more question? One more quick question? Oral question, anyone?
Do you think that the rise of all these ideas in Provence occurred because so many Jews were killed in the Crusades, and then people started thinking a lot about death? And similarly to how the Christian religion arose with its obsession with afterlife and being saved, right when so many Jews were being killed by the Romans.
Yeah, one could speculate, but it would be very hard to. It's certainly a plausible idea. On the other hand, there have been a lot of tragedies in Jewish history. It's hard to say. It's hard to say, but it's certainly possible. But it's hard to say. The exact, most of the ideas we've looked at so far have deep origins in rabbinic texts. We didn't have time to show all the parallels and all the ways in which the Kabbalistic texts developed their rabbinic texts. Gilgul is really something that comes fully into Judaism really at this time in the 12th century. Again, although it certainly seems to have had antecedents in earlier times, it's a little bit unclear why or how, and a lot of that is sort of lost. All right, I'm going to go on now to.
I think it's fair to say that we have very scant evidence in terms of the classical text of this doctrine of Gilgul. I can't remember in the entire Talmud reference to it at all.
I don't think there is.
There's really nothing in the Bible about it. So
No.
it may have been, passed down mouth to mouth, but in terms of our classic text, it's really not present, or it's not obviously present at all. So it's very interesting that it's one of those doctrines that truly is a soul, you would say. It's very well kept secret.
Yes, I mean, as I say, there is evidence that Jews believed in, that at least some Jews believed in reincarnation in earlier centuries. Again, Sadia's denouncing of that suggests that, and the certain Karaite sects believed in it, certainly the Kabbalists tried to read back into Talmudic texts hints of Gilgul, probably not accurately. All right. Now, the full development of this idea of Gilgul, although it comes in the 12th century, it's developed in the Zohar in a particular context, then the Tikkunei Zohar, and then in Rekanati, and in all these following texts. But it really receives its fullest elaboration in Tzfat, in the land of Israel, in the 16th century, in the great flourishing of Kabbalah around the circles of Moses Cordovero and especially Isaac Luria. And Isaac Luria's main redactor of his teachings was Chaim Vital, and he wrote wrote two books on it, one called Shar HaGilgulim, the Gates of Reincarnations, the other called Sefer HaGilgulim, the Book of Reincarnations. And that's where the most elaborate, extremely elaborate version of this doctrine is. Now, just a quick reminder, a refresher course from earlier sessions, right? In the Zohar, there are 3 soul levels that a person can attain. Difficult to translate. I didn't really leave them transliterated because the translations don't really work. In rabbinic texts, actually explicitly in one midrash, they use these terms and 2 others as synonyms, explicitly says they're synonyms, but the Zohar treats them as distinct levels, and these levels are distinct both during and after life. And we saw the afterlife distinction of these 3 levels a couple of sessions ago. And these 3 levels are nefesh, which one could roughly translate, not translate exactly, but what it roughly means is vitality, the animal soul, the vegetative soul, something. Ruach, rough translation, spirit. The neshama, rough translation, soul. And they're in this hierarchy, nefesh, ruach, neshama. Okay, with that little reminder, refresher course, we turn to this passage from Chaim Vital's The Gate of Reincarnations. Okay, and here, and some of this is, he's just restating the doctrine that's already in the Zohar 3 centuries earlier. When the body of a person is born, his nefesh enters him. So the nefesh is born with the body. It's sort of what animates the body. And as we saw in earlier texts, it then stays with the body in the grave. If his actions are fitting, he will merit his ruach, his spirit, which will enter him at the completion of his 13th year. Or in my understanding, that's when you're first eligible for a ruach, when he is called the complete person, apparently at the end of the 13th year. If henceforth his actions are even more fitting, then his neshama will enter him at the completion of his 20th year. And again, I understand this as that's when you become eligible for neshama, not that if you don't get it in your 20th year, you've blown it. Okay. So, but this doesn't necessarily happen. If he does not completely rectify his ruach, then the neshama will not enter him, and only his nefesh and ruach will be in him. Likewise, if he doesn't completely rectify his nefesh, then he will only have his nefesh. He will remain without ruach and neshama. The ruach and neshama will remain in a place known to the Blessed Holy. Okay? Now, this is the idea, again, that the human being is a unity of various components, parts, right? And you develop, and this is an intuitive idea, right? You've all developed. You've all developed since you were first born, I hope. Certainly physically, everybody here on the screen has since they were first born, and I'm sure also mentally and emotionally and spiritually. And here they divide into these 3 component parts, the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama. Later, Kabbalah adds 2 other levels. But not everybody completes themselves. Not everybody gets the nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Some people stay at earlier stages of development, right? And these ruach and neshama, again, which paradoxically both belong to the person and do not belong to the person, they stay in a place known only to God. And the person can live their whole life at the level of nefesh and never get there. And the parts that are there, their ruach and neshama, which, again, as I say, paradoxically do and do not belong to them, are and are not part of them, they're somewhere else. They stay somewhere else. You never get to be who you could be, your ruach and neshama. So then what happens? I bet you know what's coming next. Indeed, if a person does not completely rectify his nefesh the first time and leaves this world, the nefesh will have to come back in Gilgul, reincarnate, even many times until it is completely refined as required. Then, even after the nefesh is completed, its ruach will not enter it during the second lifetime, since the nefesh was rectified only through reincarnation. In other words, in the first lifetime, you can get all 3 levels. You can go all the way from nefesh to neshama. But if you blow it in the first lifetime, let's say you don't get you don't completely perfect your nefesh, you don't do a complete tikkun on your nefesh, then you have to come back and work on your nefesh. But you can't go further in that lifetime because you mess up the first time. You can only, if you're coming back in Gilgul, you can only perfect 1 soul level at a time. So this is the lifetime. You've come back a second time, you have to now work on your nefesh. And then you have to die and come back again and try to get your ruach. So if a person does not completely rectify his nefesh the first time, leaves this world, the nefesh will have to reincarnate even many times until it is completely refined as required. Then even after the nefesh is completed, its ruach will not enter it during the second lifetime, since the nefesh was rectified only through reincarnation. Therefore, he will have to die, and the nefesh will have to return and reincarnate, and then it will merit its ruach. If he also rectifies the ruach, does tikkun on the ruach, he will have to die, after which he will reincarnate, and the neshama will come into him in the same way as it is with the ruach. So then it's each one lifetime per soul level, and you have to do the work on that soul level. If the ruach is not rectified, they will have to reincarnate many times the nefesh with the ruach until the ruach is rectified. Then the person will die, and the nefesh and ruach will reincarnate with the neshama as well.
Nathaniel, I had just a clarification question.
Yes.
Who or what determines to which body the soul returns?
Well, that's a really good question, right? What's interesting in this book, the Shar Gilgulim, is that God doesn't make much of an appearance in this book. Occasionally, God appears in this book to basically when he feels a need to sort of like shore up the system, but it is pretty much described almost without reference to a guiding a guide. There's something that happens where this question of which body comes up in a very I don't want to talk about here because it's too complicated, about what happens at the time of the resurrection of the dead. Which body will get the soul? And it turns a very complicated thing. It turns out it could be split among many bodies. That was already in the 13th century, they discussed this. Sparks of the soul could be resurrected in various bodies. One thing I want to say here is that, again, I want to relate this to things we did earlier, this notion of the human being as a composite of many aspects and of striving for unification. So the goal of these reincarnations is the unification of all your aspects. It's all about the unification. There's a nefesh, ruach, and neshama that could in principle belong together, but only if you work on it, only if you've done the work on the self to complete each level at a time. By the way, there is a term that's around today in sort of, I don't know if New Age circles, but anyway, in spiritual circles, called spiritual bypassing. It's a pejorative term. It's the image of people who say, I'm so spiritual, I mean, I meditate every day, and I have visions and all that, but they haven't actually done the basic work of being a good person in their daily lives, or of being able to relate to other people, right? But I think they can bypass all that and go right to the highest level, right? I don't know if people are familiar with this term, spiritual bypassing. It's a great term. In a way, that's what's being said here. No spiritual bypassing. You have to do the work on your nefesh. Then you have to do the work on your ruach. Then you have to do the work on neshama. And only then, the end of this passage, until the three of them are rectified, after which there will no longer be any need to reincarnate. Once the neshama is rectified, he will be a complete person.
Who was the person here, though? That's my question. If the
That
soul was coming back in 6 different people, who was the self here?
Exactly. I think that's the question that I love about these texts. That the question that emerges from these texts, right, which we've seen before. We've seen this before. The question that emerges from the text is, who is the person, right? Right. So then you could ask yourselves, who are you? Everyone on the screen. Are you the parent, the child, the lawyer, the doctor, the teacher, the social worker, the consumer, the TV watcher, the prayer in synagogue, the volunteer worker? Who are you? Right? Well, you probably would tell me, well, I'm really a combination of those. Who are you? Your 1-year-old self, your 5-year-old self, your 27-year-old self, your 75-year-old self. Who are you? Well, you'd say, well, really, I'm a work in progress, right? Well, that's what's being said here, right? And we saw that, but that question arises, right? We saw that question in the text about the sleeping person who is near death. And it says at night their soul wanders around, and they're lying there, and their soul is wandering here, and actually gets even more, and their image is darkening, and their likeness is being blocked, and their soul is over there, and this image of death as a kind of disintegration, right? Which is also obviously has a physical correlate, right? Really raises the question of who are you? There was a very famous rock song when I was a teenager that I won't sing, but the people who are of a certain age know that song. Who are you? Who? It's a good question. It shows that group was I can't remember who was it. The Who sang that song. It shows that they had secret Kabbalistic teaching. Let me take one question before I go on, because there's another teaching that I just have to do tonight. Let me take one oral question. Anyone want to ask a question? Let me should I take a question from the chat?
A question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
If you are talking about reincarnation and a spirit or a soul or some kind of energy enters a live person's body, is it for the benefit of the soul that's being reincarnated into you, or is it the benefit of the person who is the recipient?
Well, that's a great question. So, and we're actually about to embark. The next unit here that we're just about to do raises that question in a very sharp form. In the usual case, right? The idea here is that in the usual case of Gilgul, right? The Gilgul is with the nefesh of the original person. The nefesh comes back into a new body. That's the usual case, and then strives to get a ruach. And then if the nefesh and ruach come back, they strive to get a neshama, right? So that's the usual thing. There are really complicated cases, and let me kick in these next texts, because these texts really raise the question, and these texts are coming towards the end of our month together, and these I want these texts to really blow you away. Because these texts, if you think the other texts raise the question of who are you, these questions really raise that question, right? Who are you, right? You know, most people on this screen, I think probably most people, probably not everybody, most people on the screen speak English as their first language. Not everybody, I'm sure, right? You know, well, obviously that's a historical accident, you know. Could have ended up somewhere else. You would have speaking somewhere else. Your ancestors spoke different languages, right? You might speak more than one language. Who are you? What's the relationship between your relationship to these long historical processes? How, you know, English itself is a composite of several languages. Who are you? What does it mean to speak English? Are you an Anglo or a Saxon or a Norman, or who are you? Right? What does it mean to even speak English? English itself is sort of a composite language of many different languages, as are most languages, frankly. Okay, but here we're going to get to something that I really want to knock your socks off with. So now this word ibur, which started out as one of the words that was sort of a synonym for Gilgul in the 13th century, now it takes on a very different meaning in Luriana Kabbalah. Here it means receiving help and spiritual advancement from a deceased tzaddik, a deceased righteous person who enters the body. And here's where your question, Charles, really becomes very acute. So it starts off with a question: what can be done for a person who is still alive, whose nefesh alone has been rectified? Oopsie, that's a typo, not without but without being able to receive their ruach in that lifetime. Remember, if nefesh comes back in Gilgul, they can't get the next level. They first have to complete the nefesh, then die and be reincarnated in order to receive the ruach. So what are you supposed to do? You've perfected your nefesh. You're only, 25, and hopefully you have a long life ahead of you. How are you supposed to make spiritual progress? And here's just where I explain it, but you can read this at home. Now, the mystery matter is this. Depending on the level of refinement and the level of rectification of this nefesh, of the living person, here's what happens, what can happen. A nefesh of a deceased righteous person, a deceased tzaddik, who has already completed his rectifications and reincarnations, in other words, doesn't need to reincarnate for himself anymore, that nefesh can reincarnate or go into in Gilgul, but here with the specific term of ibur, pregnancy, into the body of this person while he is still alive. In other words, you can receive as inspiration for your spiritual progress the spirit of someone who has died. And they will inhabit you. And this is called in Luriana Kabbalah, ibur, pregnancy. You become pregnant with the spirit of someone who has died. It's sort of a spirit guide, right? And now your question becomes really complicated, right? And actually even the preceding question, right? It's this idea of who is inhabiting you, your own nefesh, and the nefesh of this deceased tzaddik. Again, this requires you to have really perfected yourself. And in other parts, it says the quality of the tzaddik that you might receive really depends on your tikkun and how much work you've done. If you've done a lot of work on the self, you could even receive, they say, the Abraham Avinu, if you've really done an amazing job on yourself. And what I want to say about this doctrine is, although it seems wild, I think it also seems kind of a lot really accessible, paradoxically, right? Many of us have been inspired by people who've come before, right? You really read some book and you get obsessed with whoever, whatever it is. I like to study philosophy, so I read Simone de Beauvoir. I just read her, and I feel like so identified with Simone de Beauvoir. I feel like when I write, I'm sort of channeling her, right? In a way, there's something very intuitive about this. Let's see what it says. So again, here's just my explanation. The classic case of Gilgul is a nefesh returning in a new body from birth. The form of reincarnation now under discussion can occur after birth throughout the person's life. It's called ibur, pregnancy, because the person becomes spiritually impregnated with an additional soul from another person. And then Chaim Vital continues. The nefesh of the deceased tzaddik will enter the living person, taking the place of a ruach in relation to the nefesh of this living person. In other words, normally, after you perfect, if it's not normally, but in the first lifetime, after you've completed the first level, the nefesh level, then you can get the ruach to make spiritual progress. But because you've come back a second time, you can't get your own ruach. So you get the nefesh of another tzaddik, which serves the function of a ruach. In other words, basically it serves the function of allowing you to make spiritual progress by relying on this spirit who's within you, who's from a deceased righteous person. Someone asked in the chat, how is this different from schizophrenia? That's a very interesting question. I think you mean multiple personality disorder, but okay, I understand the question. And then this is Chaim Vital. Thus, the living person has one, his own nefesh. Two, the nefesh of the righteous person. Wait, oh, I'm sorry. Wait. It is also possible that sometimes it will occur that the nefesh of one righteous person will be an ibur in a living person. And after that, the living person will merit an ibur of another nefesh from a different righteous person greater than the first. Thus, the living person has his own nefesh, the nefesh of the righteous person who first came to him, which is to him like a ruach, and the second nefesh of the greater righteous person, which came to him last, which will be like a neshama for him. So you're walking down the street, you're walking up Broadway, and you look like there's, people are walking with their individual bodies walking down the street, but you never know. The person sitting next to you, walking down Broadway, within themselves could have the nefesh of, and it says up to 3 tzaddikim. Right. Now, people are asking about multiple personalities and all that. I think the idea here is that they're really here to help you in your spiritual progress. So and in fact, he says, they'll only stay with you as long as you're making spiritual progress. But if you go, down a wrong path, they'll leave you. They don't have to stay with you. They're really there to help you, right? To help you make spiritual progress so that you can integrate yourself. And again, I know this sounds wild, but just think of it. If you don't want to go down the wild path, think of it as inspiration. And if you've ever read a book or been inspired by a piece of music, so much so that you've taken it really within yourselves, a text, a book, a poem, a song, an idea, That's the kind of thing that they're getting at here. Let me take a quick question because there's one more passage I want to do, Beth.
I'm wondering a couple of things. One is, are there enough deceased tzaddikim to go around? And another question is, in terms of this impregnation, is like, for example, I'm a woman. So if I were impregnated by a tzaddikim, would I be carrying the tzaddikim, the tzaddik, as if I were the tzaddik's mother? I'm just not quite grasping that. But my main question is, are there enough tzaddikim to go around?
Well, I think that let me actually take the other question, right? The question of, when you say you like that tzaddik's mother, right? I think that the use of this term ibur is very evocative, right? Right. I mean, those of you who have given birth, right, have had this experience of carrying another soul within yourselves, having another spirit within yourselves, another person, right? And I think that's why they use this term, right? You're carrying this other spirit within you. Those of us who have not had the zchut of carrying another person in that physical way, right? That is this idea. It's really calling on this other person, right? And they will only stay with you, as it says, as long as you are doing tikkun, as long as you're doing work on the self, right? As far as the gender issue goes, very, very interesting stuff about gender in this book, right? There's a lot about gender in this book. Some of it is appealing to our sensibilities, some of it is definitely not appealing to our sensibilities. But one thing it does is, and curiously, although this book seems steeped in pre-modern ideas or not modern ideas, in a way, there's a certain postmodern quality to this work. And we're seeing the self, right, as a component, as a composite of various component of parts that are maybe unifying, right, that you have to work to bring together, that maybe come from different sources, right, that shouldn't be taken for granted, the stability and solidity of the self. There's something about this image of the self in this work that, as I say, is really does appeal in some way to the postmodern imagination.
Nathaniel, can I just jump in for 1 second here? Just wanted to raise sort of a question. I guess it's a question or a comment. I mean, I think what you've said in presenting it is you are presented in such a way that we could actually relate to it in terms of relating to those who have come before us, in terms of relating to a book that we read, or even a fictional character or whatever. But I just would point out that, when Chaim Vital writes about this, he doesn't mean that. I mean, he means where you're engaged in an act of translation. But I think we have to just be aware of the fact that every translation is, in some sense, is not true to the initial idea, because he was talking about ruach, nefesh, neshama. He's talking about something that he's not talking about how we relate to it. I presume he means actually he sees it as realities, that there is this incarnated soul or whatever, and takes these various forms. And just as the Christians who believe in incarnation or reincarnation, incarnation, in strict Christian doctrine, God's soul is incarnated in the human, who is divine as well. And we can understand that in many different ways, the potential for the human to grow, Tselem Elohim, and all that, which is very beautiful. Christmas is a beautiful holiday, actually, the potential of every individual. But for strict Christian theology, it's not about a beautiful holiday. It's about actually God being incarnated in the human. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Great. So David has now, unmasked my method here, although I was quite upfront about it in the beginning. And this is what I want to say about that. Yes, on the one hand, yes, I want to make these texts accessible even to the most skeptical among you. So that is definitely one of my goals. I want to make these texts, right, which might, for the skeptics among you, lead to simply eyebrow raising or eye rolling. And I want to make them accessible in terms that anyone can relate to. That's one goal. So no question about it. But then I have a sort of a mischievous other goal, which is I want you then to reinterpret your experience. When you say, oh, it's just that I was inspired by Mozart, but it's not like Mozart came and inhabited me. Well, why don't you take that seriously? Let's take your that whole inspiration. The only reason you say nothing really happened was because you have a particular image of what it means to be a self, which means to be a bounded self, impermeable, right? If you say what I am, my boundaries are actually permeable. I speak English, right? I didn't invent English. English in a way is speaking through me as much as I am speaking English. In fact, probably more so. I have probably less impact on English than English has on me, right? So it's actually literally true that English is not, I don't own English. English isn't a fact of my psyche. English long predates me and will long outlast me and shapes my thoughts at least as much as I shape my thoughts and perhaps even more. And again, I refer you back to everybody's experience who speaks more than one language, or even if you only speak another language a little bit, even if you only pray in another language, you know that the translation is very hard, that it shapes actually your actual experience of it. So I want it to work both ways. I want to make these texts accessible to the skeptics, and I want the skeptics to reinterpret, to try to start reinterpreting some of those experiences in terms of this real image of how it works, and ask yourselves, what is your image of yourself such that you think that it's not possible when I'm inspired so deeply by an author, a composer, and so forth, that nothing is really happening because I'm a bounded self. The image of the bounded self is actually a very modern, extremely modern idea. But I want to go through that right now, because there's one more thing I want to do before I which is this. So now I'm going to even more so, David, in what you're talking about, reincarnation as love. So even more so, I'm going down that road. Because here there's a passage, it turns out Ibur can happen even during the lifetime of both a tzaddik and a person in need of spiritual help. And it is something like love. In fact, almost explicitly towards the end of this passage. It is even possible that a tzaddik was alive together with a person during this life. At the same time, they're both alive at the same time. That tzaddik's nefesh can become impregnated within him. So now we're talking about reincarnation during the lifetime of both people. For when this person performs a certain mitzvah or mitzvot associated with that tzaddik, which he performs properly like that tzaddik, then the nefesh of that tzaddik can become impregnated within him, even though they are both living at the same time. That's pretty wild. But it's really like love.
I mean, Nathaniel, can I just jump in?
Wait, one second. Let me just finish this, because I just want to get to this point here. And this is the mystery of the verse. And this is a paraphrase of a verse from 1 Samuel. And the nefesh of David cleaved to the nefesh of Jonathan. For even though they were both living at the same time, the nefesh of David became impregnated within Jonathan. Right. And here
I think you can do better than that, though. I think that there is one story where you do have a sense that the other person's soul enters into someone else. Because in the case of David and Jonathan, it says that the David's soul, Nikshara, was connected to Jonathan.
Yes.
David, but there's a different story, and that's Eliyahu Hanavi. When Eliyahu Hanavi is ascending, just before he ascends to heaven, he asks his pupil Elisha, "What do you want?" And Elisha says, "Pishnayim baruchacha elai."
Yes. Beautiful.
Which is actually very interesting. What does it mean, Pishnayim? And does it mean I want to be your main disciple? But what it literally says, I want the double portion of your soul. So there you actually have a situation where at least the text has a suggestion that somehow Eliyahu lives on through his pupil. And I think that's actually very true. I think that, in Joshua and Moshe, that I mean, it's how that works is a great mystery, but that somehow the pupil, the teacher lives on through the student. The student has imbibed the soul of the teacher. Doesn't happen that often, but I think it can happen. And when Elio and Elisha, you have that, which is very striking. There you have a sense of Pishnayim Baruchacha. That would be an interesting text to think more about.
Yes, it's beautiful, right? And you know, I think that one of the interesting things about the text he does give is that he misquotes it. He quotes it as saying "Vatidbak nefesh David b'nefesh Yonatan," which is actually not what the verse says. And it's an interesting. He's obviously quoting from memory, right? And it's anyway. There's a lot we could say about that if we had another few hours. Alberto, you've had your hand up for a long time.
And mute. So I read in disability studies reference to a person with cognitive disabilities as potentially having a nefesh of a tzaddik that has returned to complete the work. And it's sort of, I couldn't find the reference, it suggested some kind of mystical Jewish writing. But I encountered this a couple of times, and I'm wondering whether there is any kind of connection to what we're talking about, or is this totally made up?
I'm not familiar with that idea, so I couldn't really speak about it. Again, I'm the images I'm thinking of are the kind of thing that David is talking about, the relationship of teacher and student. I'm also thinking about love relationships. Those of you who fell in love with your first sweetheart and have been married for 75 years haven't had this experience, but those of you who have had perhaps more than one love relationship in your lives may have this experience that something of previous loves form your personality or part of you. If you've had more than one deep love relationship, right? You may have had, I mean, I know, basically I'm speaking for myself, have the experience of previous, love partners being part of you and actually changing you, shaping you. And in a way, that's part of what's being taught, this idea of ibur during the lifetime of both people, right, is partly what is being spoken about here. Certainly, and as David said, people have come under the influence of a very, very influential teacher, have had this experience. Questions? We did a lot tonight. I wanted to end with a bang. Thomas.
Yes. Well, my initial question, which I had posted, was: are there any writings about interactions between nefesh, ruach, and neshama, or And then I just thought more broadly, as we got deeper into relationships between people, tzaddikim and others, relationships. Is there a nefesh that yearns for a specific nefesh? Is there a neshama that seeks to be aligned with a certain ruach, or any kind of connection that way?
Yeah, so I realize we're running out of time. Let me just say about the relationship between nefesh and ruach and neshama. If you go back a couple of classes, it really describes the relationship after death, and that after death, as well as during the life, there's an idea that it has to be a process of unification. And remember, the nefesh was near the grave, and the ruach was in the lower Garden of Eden, and the neshama was in the upper Garden of Eden, and they really, form their closest connection on actually at the eve of, on the Motzei Shabbat, at the end of Shabbat, at the end of Rosh Chodesh, the end of Yom Tov, is when they have their most intense connection. So that even after death, it remains a process of unity. It's always a process. Everything in Kabbalistic image of the self is always about a process of unification. So that was the first question. The second question, so in this book from the 16th century, this book by Chaim Vital, there are a number of hints at practices of how to, and it's clear that when he goes on about this ibur, he's clear that he has in mind work that he himself has done and how to basically invoke the spirits of various deceased ancestors, and specific techniques and specific mitzvot that might induce a deceased person, some great tzaddik from the past to come in and inhabit one's body. And there are hints throughout this book of actual practices, not laid out in any detail or any specificity, but there. And I would, again, if we had a few more hours, I would go through some of these. But it's quite clear that this is not just theoretical for him, that it clearly corresponds to practices. And he wrote this book that we looked at a passage from before, called the Book of Visions, in which he talks about his extensive spiritual practices involving going to clairvoyance and Muslim sheikhs and all kinds of people to help him in his spiritual path. So that's that is a sort of a hidden side of this. I see that it's 9:20. Do I have time? Do I have time to one more question? No.
Could you look at my husband's question?
One last question. How's that?
Okay, one last question is good for today.
One last question. Who's asking it?
I was asking, my husband wanted to know, if a spirit enters a living person, how would you know whether it's a good spirit or a dybbuk, if there is such a thing? And so then the question then becomes, I believe also, what's your experience while it's within you? Are you aware of it as you are pregnant, when you're pregnant with a child?
Great questions, and maybe a good place to end on. It's clear here in this kind of way of thinking that becoming aware of these things, becoming aware of what is, forget about Gilgul, becoming aware of what your current spiritual task is, whether or not you believe in any of this, become aware of what your current spiritual, existential, psychological, human task is, requires a great deal of self-awareness. And it's also clear here that there was a practice of going to Kabbalists, Isaac the Blind. People came to him, apparently, to find out. People came to Isaac Luria. Chaim Vital asked anyone he could to talk about the state of his soul. That this is not something that is obviously something that needs to be done through work on the self, to becoming aware of where you're at in this spiritual journey. And again, whether or not you believe in reincarnation in any form, even if you're just a skeptic and a rationalist, it's also true. Where are you at? Where do you have to go now, right? And that some people see psychoanalysts. So people in Provence went to see Isaac the Blind. People in Sfat went to see Isaac Luria. Maybe some people here have the merit of having somebody like that in their lives. So that, I think that's a really great place to end. And I want to thank everybody for being so attentive and listening and asking great questions. And thanks for coming on this journey with us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would want to say one last word, just in terms of the last question. That the question, as Nathaniel said, for those who believe, and this is across religions, that they have a mission in this world, and how do we know what the mission is? There's a book by, I think, a woman named Berman, who talks exactly about this issue. I've had conversations where people say, I have to do something else. I'm waiting for God to tell me. And I asked them, if God does tell you, are you going to hear it? And this friend of mine said, I think so. I think I will have a sense. So that's, I think, a very fundamental question. How do we know what our purpose is in this world? And if God speaks to us, we'll be able to hear it. And I think that's a great question. I hope the answer is that for most of us, the answer is we will hear it. So thank you all for participating. And Evie, you want to say a couple of words about other programs? And we go to learn together in different venues. And thank you, Nathaniel.
If we only had about 50 more hours, right? Thank you so much, Dr. Berman and Rabbi Silber. Thank you to everyone who joined us today here on Zoom and also on Drisha Live and on Facebook for those of us, those who watched us live. We continue our spring program tomorrow at 1 p.m. with the second class in the series, Divrei Dever, Responsa in Plague Time with Rabbi Zakir. So I hope to see you there. We always have many classes happening, so you can go on our website, www.drisha.org/classes. To look what we have, what offerings we have. We add classes, new classes all the time. Thank you again, Dr. Berman, and I hope to see everyone again soon at one of our classes here at
we have a
Rita.
program, and we have a program before Shavuot, which should be extraordinarily interesting.
Yeah, we do
Very
also have,
interesting program before Shavuot and other things as well. So stay tuned. Thank
yeah,
you all.
next week we have a Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening, and Thursday evenings. All 3 evenings at 8 p.m. we have the Shavuot program. So definitely stay tuned for information about that. And you can also look on the website for information. We really hope to see you there. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.